Hey guys, Uncommon Ramen here. Just as a reminder, if you like my content, please hit that like and subscribe button to help me with those analytics. And also, if you want to be informed when my content releases, hit the bell icon. It'll let you know when I upload new content. And as always, if you feel the need to support me, hit me up on my Patreon at patreon.com/uncommonramen, capital U, capital R. I do all of this in my free time, so any amount of support can help me bring more of this content to you more often. So without further ado, I am going to do yet another deck tech, and this is just kind of a normal thing for me. I don't know why I brew so many decks, but they're just fun to do. So today I wanted to take a look at Alela Artful Provocateur. So, I had mentioned in one of my previous videos that there were certain wedges and certain color pairings that I just hadn't made decks for, and I'm in the process of trying to put those together. This happened to be one. Esper was a shard that I had not built for, and so now I have a new deck tech with that. I didn't want to build something that was... I wanted to build something that was unusual, in my opinion. And while I was looking for things to build for Esper, Alela popped up, and it was something that I had laying around that I really wanted to use. But I didn't know how to use her, so what ended up happening was I put together a vehicles deck. And this is really funny because the Shirokai Precon kind of jump starts you into this deck. Now, I'm not going to say every card in here, but a good 50% of the cards in here are actually in that Shirokai Precon deck. So it actually really worked out in that sense. You're going to have to find other cards throughout other sets, but this is what I came to. It's Alela vehicles. So let's just take a look at the commander and talk about the reasons. Alright, we got Alela Artful Provocateur. This is a white, a blue, and a black to cast. It's a 2/3. It's flying, death touch, lifelink. It gives other flying creatures that I control +1/+0. And whenever you cast an artifact or enchantment spell, you get to create a 1/1 blue fairy creature token with flying. So, first off, the vehicles are all artifacts. So we're going to get a trigger off of that where we get a little 1/1 fairy token with flying. But that 1/1 fairy token with flying, because of her other ability, is actually going to be a 2/1, which is really great for this deck because we're going to be looking for a lot of ways to crew vehicles, and any amount of extra oomph on power helps to crew those vehicles a little bit faster. So that is one of the biggest reasons why I chose Alela. Okay, next up we're going to take a look at creatures. A lot of these are going to be pretty obvious creatures. So for starters, we got Aeronaut Admiral. This is 3 and a white for a 3/1 with flying. Vehicles you control have flying. So we're just going to make it as evasive as possible so we can swing in and get as much damage in as possible. We have Katsumasa, God of the Voyage. This is 2 and a blue for a 2/4. At the beginning of your upkeep, you may exile Katsumasa. If you do, it gains whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control. If Katsumasa is exiled, you may put a voyage counter on it. If you don't, return Katsumasa to the battlefield with X +1/+1 counters on it, and draw X cards, where X is the number of voyage counters on it. So it also has a flip side. I'll go into that in just a moment. This front side here is a really great early game to try and draw extra cards if you're in a situation where you're not drawing cards. This is just a really good way to fix that. And that does happen in this deck. However, the big reason it's in here is for its flip side, so we're going to pull that off real quick. So we can show you the Omen Keel. So for 1 and a blue, you get a 3/3 vehicle. Whenever a vehicle you control deals combat damage to a player, that player exiles that many cards from the top of their library. You may play lands from among those cards for as long as they remain exiled. So it's a really cool way to ensure land drops are happening. You're playing 3 colors, so chances are at least one of your opponents is playing something that you're playing. So it's a great way to ensure land drops are happening. And since it sees all vehicles, it's not just the Omen Keel. And it only crews for 1. Sorry. Next up we have Cyberdrive Awakener. This guy is 5 and a blue for a 4/4 flying. Other artifact creatures you control have flying. And whenever Cyberdrive Awakener enters the battlefield, until end of turn, each non-creature artifact you control becomes an artifact creature with base power and toughness of 4/4. This is cool on two levels. The first one being all other artifact creatures you control have flying. So when you crew your vehicles, if they don't have flying, suddenly they do have flying because of Cyberdrive Awakener. The other thing is that you can actually use this even if you've been board wiped, to turn all of your vehicles into 4/4 creatures and still be able to swing out. And I think that's really important to understand, that if you get board wiped that is a creature-specific board wipe, your vehicles live. So things like Cyberdrive Awakening, Dance in the Manse, Rise and Shine, those are all very good cards to use in those situations. Next up we have Drum Bellower. This is 2 and a white, flying, 2/1. Untap all creatures you control during each player's untap step. This is almost an absolute necessity in this deck. You're going to be crewing your vehicles, which means you're going to be tapping out a lot of the time. This allows you to untap, and then should you be in a position where you need to block, you can actually do so. If you still have other vehicles untapped, you can actually crew those vehicles to block, and then you just continuously untap at the end of each player's untap steps. It's just a great way to synergize with the deck. Next we have Emery, Lurker of the Lock, 2 and a white, or sorry, 2 and a blue, my bad. For a 1/2, this spell costs 1 less to cast for each artifact you control. When Emery, Lurker of the Lock enters the battlefield, mill 4 cards. And then you can tap her to choose target artifact card from your graveyard, and you can cast that this turn. It's a great way to get recursion. Your opponents are going to do as much as they can to try and get rid of your bigger, better vehicles, so this is a great way to get those back. Next we have Ethereum Sculptor. This is a 1 and a blue for a 1/2. Artifact spells cost 1 less to cast, so we just make them cheaper. We got Foundry Inspector. This is 3 for a 3/2. Artifact spells cost 1 less to cast. Again, we're going for that redundancy. We can get to the point where they become free. Next up, we have Greasefang, Okiba Boss. This is 1 white and a black. At the beginning of combat on your turn, return target vehicle card from your graveyard to the battlefield. It gains haste, and then return it to its owner's hand at the beginning of your next end step. So again, it's a great way to recur vehicles that have died, and instead of it being like super OP where it stays in the battlefield, it just goes back to your hand, so you can recast it later. It's not super efficient, but it's good enough to get that recursion. And he's a 4/3, by the way. Next up we have Hannah, Ship's Navigator, 1 white and a blue for a 1/2. For 1 white and a blue, you can tap her, return target artifact or enchantment card from your graveyard to your hand. Again, we're going for that recursion. Next we have Hotshot Mechanic. This is 1 white for a 2/1. Hotshot Mechanic crews vehicles as though it had power. As though its power were 2 greater. This is really cool because it crews for 4, and there are some vehicles in here that have crew costs that are extremely high. This right here can sometimes just solo crew some of those bigger vehicles. Next we have Joyous Familiar. This is 4 for a 2/2 flying. Historic spells cost 1 less to cast. Historic spells are artifacts, legendaries, and sagas. So not only is this going to hit my legendary creatures, as well as actually for that matter, any legendary in here, but this is also going to hit the vehicles. So we're just, again, getting redundancy on that mana reduction. Next up we have Katsumasa the Animator. This is 2 and 2 blue for a 3/3 flying. You can tap 2 and a blue until end of turn. Target non-creature artifact you control becomes an artifact creature and gains flying. If it's not a vehicle, it has a base power and toughness of 1/1 until end of turn. And at the beginning of your upkeep, put a +1/+1 counter on each of up to 3 target non-creature artifacts. So this guy is specifically looking at vehicles to be most efficient, but you can put these +1/+1 counters on almost anything, because again, we are personally running Dance in the Manse and Rise and Shine in here, so anything that will allow the artifacts to get bigger and then turn them into creatures is just a personal win right there. On top of that, you can tap 2 and a blue to turn one of your non-creature artifacts into a creature, and if you target a vehicle, that's basically crewing it without having to crew it, because it already has its own power and toughness when it becomes a creature. If it's not a creature, then it just becomes a 1/1, but again, with +1/+1 counters, it's going to slowly but surely get bigger. Next we have King Makar, the Gold Curse. This is 2 and 2 black for a 2/3. He's got Inspired. Whenever King Makar, the Gold Curse, becomes untapped, you may exile target creature. If you do, put a colorless artifact token named Gold onto the battlefield. It has sacrifice this artifact, add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. So this is a very interesting card. One of the biggest problems this card has is figuring out how to become untapped, essentially. It's a 2/3, so it's not exactly commanding a large body, which means that the later the game goes, the less likely you are to attack with it. So you have to find other ways to tap it. This is the perfect deck for that because you can just use him to crew vehicles. You're going to tap him to crew vehicles, and then he's going to untap during your turn, which means he gets his Inspired trigger. This is going to become a huge problem for your opponents because they're going to have to find a way to deal with this. Otherwise, every turn they're going to have to exile a... was it creature? Yeah, target creature. And exile is fantastic because it hits creatures with indestructible. Next up we got Kotori Pilot Prodigy. This is a white and a blue for a 2/4. Vehicles you control have crew 2, so we're going to change the vehicle crew. And then at the beginning of combat on your turn, target artifact creature you control gains lifelink and vigilance until end of turn. So even if we do crew something, we're going to give it lifelink and vigilance. That's pretty freaking cool. This again is in the precon, and it's just too good not to have in here. Next we have Padim, Council of Innovation. This is 3 and a blue for a 1/4. Artifacts you control have hexproof, and at the beginning of your upkeep, if you control the artifact with the highest converted mana cost or tied for the highest converted mana cost, you get to draw a card. So it's a small draw card engine, and it gives hexproof to your artifacts. This is super good because your opponents at some point in time are going to get very tired of your vehicles, and this is a great way to protect them. Next we have Research Thief. This is 4 and a blue for a 3/3 flash flying. Whenever an artifact creature you control deals combat damage to a player, draw a card. It's very similar to things like Coastal Piracy or Reconnaissance Mission. Next we have Sai Master Thopterist, 2 and a blue for a 1/4. Whenever you cast an artifact spell, create a 1/1 colorless Thopter artifact creature token with flying. And then for 1 blue, you can sacrifice 2 artifacts to draw a card. So in dire situations, you have a draw card engine here. In best case scenario, you actually have something that creates little tokens that can be used to crew, and that's just exactly what this deck needs. Next we have Sad Robot. This is 4 for a 2/2. Whenever Solemn Simulacrum enters the battlefield, you may search your library for a basic land card, put that card onto the battlefield, tap, then shuffle your library. And whenever Solemn Simulacrum dies, you may draw a card. This is in here for obvious reasons. First off, it's an artifact. Secondly, it's ramp. And thirdly, it's card draw. Just really good. And then finally, among creatures, we have Sram, Senior Edificer. This is 1 and a white for a 2/2. Whenever you cast an aura, equipment, or vehicle spell, you get to draw a card. So it's just a draw card engine. We have auras and we have vehicles in here. I don't think we have equipment, but I could be wrong about that. Either way, he's going to see a lot of triggers here. So that's our creatures. Next up, we're going to look at instants. Starting with Armed and Armored. This is 1 and a white. Vehicles you control become artifact creatures until end of turn. Choose a dwarf you control. Attach any number of equipment you control to it. There are no dwarves in here. At least I don't remember there being any dwarves in here. This is obviously in here for the first part. Vehicles you control become artifact creatures until end of turn. This is a great way to crew things without having a crew. Again, if you get board wiped and your opponents feel safe because now you don't have any creatures to crew your vehicles, boom, Armed and Armored. Next up we have Counterspell. Pretty simple, 2 blue, counter target spell. Pretty simple and efficient. Next up we have Despark. 1 white, 1 black, exile target permanent with mana value 4 or greater. Just a really good way to get rid of some of those really big threats. Next up, we have Dispatch. For 1 white, you can tap target creature. If you have Metalcraft, you can actually exile that creature, and Metalcraft just means you have 3 or more artifacts. That's perfect for this because this turns into a Swords to Plowshares with no downside if you have Metalcraft. Next, we have Path to Exile. This is 1 white. Exile target creature. Its controller gets to search their library for a basic land card, put that card onto the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle. Next we have Swords to Plowshares. 1 white, exile target creature. Its controller gains life equal to its power. Again, we're going all out on these exile things. Indestructible is a pain in the butt. So any way you can get that exile keyword in there to get around that is perfect. Next up we have Voidrand. 1 white, 1 blue, 1 black. This spell can't be countered. Destroy target non-land permanent. This is just a very versatile card, and it's in the right colors. Alright, next up we're going to take a look at Sorceries. Yeah. Starting with Anchor to Reality. This is 2 and 2 blue. As an additional cost to cast this spell, sacrifice an artifact or creature, search your library for an equipment or vehicle card, put that card onto the battlefield, then shuffle. If it has a mana value less than the sacrificed permanent's mana value, scry 2. This is a fantastic tutor for vehicles. Especially considering we're going to be putting out so many little tokens. Sacrificing a creature or artifact is actually small pickings, or I mean small change in this deck. So it's not a big deal. You get to search for. You're probably not going to hit that Scry 2 trigger. You might. More than likely, you're not going to hit the Scry 2 trigger. But at least you get this new vehicle to hit the table. And there are a ton of really great ETB effects in here. So this is just a really good card to have in here. Next up, we have Dance in the Manse. This is X, a white and a blue. Return up to X target creature. X target artifact and or non-aura enchantment cards, each with mana value X or less, from your graveyard to the battlefield. If X is 6 or more, those permanents are 4/4 creatures in addition to their other types. This is another way to return to a very good board state after a board wipe, especially if that board wipe hits more than just creatures, assuming that it doesn't exile. And it's another way to animate those artifacts and get in some incremental damage. Next we have Organic Extinction. This is 8 and 2 white. It has Improvise, so you can use artifacts to help cast the spell by tapping them to add 1 colorless, and you destroy all non-artifact creatures. This has ups and downs in this deck, but for the most part, it's going to leave you relatively unscathed. Next up, we have Rise and Shine for 1 and a blue. Target non-creature artifact you control becomes a 0/0 artifact creature. Put 4 +1/+1 counters on each artifact that became a creature this way. You can overload it for 4 and 2 blue. So again, we're just going to throw out a whole bunch of artifacts, turn them into 4/4s, and then attack our opponents for incremental damage. And then lastly, we have Thoughtcast. This is Affinity for Artifacts, 4 and a blue. Draw 2 cards. Next, we're going to look at the artifacts, and this is where all the vehicles will be. It also has our mana rocks and stuff like that, but this is the meat of the deck right here. There are tons of cards in here because we have vehicles galore. Starting with Aerial Surveyor. This is 2 and a white for a 3/4 flying. Whenever Aerial Surveyor attacks, if defending player controls more lands than you, search your library for a basic plains card, put that card onto the battlefield tap, then shuffle it, cruise for 2. We're dealing with white here, and white always has issues with ramps, so this is a great way to get the ramp in there. Next up, we have Arcane Signet. This is 2 cast artifact. You can tap it to add 1 mana of your commander's color identity. Next, we have Azorius Signet, 2 again. You can tap 1 and it to add blue and white. Next, we have Colossal Plow. This is 2. 2 for a 6/3. Whenever Colossal Plow attacks, add 3 white mana, and you gain 3 life until end of turn. You don't lose this mana as steps and phases end, and it cruises for 6. Next up, we have Conqueror's Galleon. This is 4 for a 2/10. When Conqueror's Galleon attacks, exile it at the end of combat, then return it to the battlefield transformed under your control. It cruises for 4, and we're going to take a look at the other side, which, again, is basically in here for the recursion. So Conqueror's Galleon turns into Conqueror's Foothold. You can tap it for colorless mana, or you can tap 2 and it to draw a card and then discard a card, or you can tap 4 and it to draw a card, or you can tap 6 and it to return target card from your graveyard to your hand. There is almost no real downside to this. This is a fantastic way to dump your mana into something so you can get some value out of it. And at the very least, you can get a card from your graveyard back. So it's just a really good card in this deck. Next up, we have Cultivator's Caravan. This is 3. Add 1 mana, or you can tap it to add 1 mana of any color. You can also crew it for 3 for a 5/5. Next we have Demir Cygnet. This is 2. You can tap 1 and it to add blue-black. Next we have Felwar Stone. This is 2. You can tap it to add 1 mana of any color that a land an opponent controls could produce. And again, we're playing 3 colors. Next up, we have Imperial Recovery Unit. 2 and a white for a 3/4. When Imperial Recovery Unit attacks, return target creature or vehicle card with mana value 2 or less from your graveyard to your hand, and it accrues for 2. It's kind of like a Sun Titan, but not. Next up, we have Imposter Mech. 1 and a blue for a 3/1. You may have Imposter Mech enter the battlefield as a copy of a creature an opponent controls, except it's a vehicle. Artifact with a crew 3, and it loses all other card types. And it also has crew 3, which seems redundant, but there's reasons for that, I'm sure. This is just a really cool way to copy something on the table that has a really fantastic ability and utilize it for yourself as well. Next we have Mech Titan Core. This is 2 for a 2/4. You can tap 5 and exile Mech Titan Core and 4 other artifact creatures and or vehicles you control to create Mech Titan, a legendary 10/10 construct artifact creature token with flying, vigilance, trample, lifelink, and haste that's all colors. When that token leaves the battlefield, return all cards exiled with Mech Titan Core, except Mech Titan Core, to the battlefield tapped under their owner's control, and you can crew it for 2. So, this is the definition of Voltron in a really funny way. Essentially, you get to create a 10/10 menacing little artifact creature vehicle thing, and after it dies, the only thing you really lose is the Mech Titan Core. I see only win-win on this. Next up, we have Mighty Servant of Luke-O. This is 3 for a 6/6 trample ward, discard a card. Whenever Mighty Servant of Luke-O becomes crewed for the first time each turn, if it was crewed by exactly 2 creatures, it gains whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, draw 2 cards until end of turn. It has crew 4. This is really great in here because the tokens that Alela makes come in as 1/1s, but she makes them 2/1s. So you can use 2 of those tokens to crew this to get that ability. It being a 6/6 trample means that you may just connect with your opponent, which means that you're probably going to draw those 2 cards. It's just a win-win in all cases. Next up, we have Mindlink Mech. This is 2 and a blue for a 4/3 flying. Whenever Mindlink Mech becomes crewed for the first time each turn until end of turn, Mindlink Mech becomes a copy of target non-legendary creature that crewed it this turn, except it's a 4/3, it's a vehicle artifact in addition to its other types, and it has flying, and it crews for 1. This is also just a really good way to get some of those attack triggers. I don't remember exactly what all the creatures were, but, you know, there's something spicy there, I'm sure. Next up, we have Mobilizer Mech, 1 and a blue for 3/4 flying. Whenever Mobilizer Mech becomes crewed, up to 1 other target vehicle you control becomes an artifact creature until end of turn, and it crews for 3. If you have more vehicles than you have crew, well, here you go. You got yourself a Mobilizer Mech. Next up, you have Mukatai Ripper. Sorry, Soul Ripper. Mukatai Soul Ripper. This is 1 and a black for a 4/3. Whenever Mukatai Soul Ripper attacks, you may sacrifice another artifact or creature. If you do, put a +1/+1 counter on Mukatai Soul Ripper, and it gains menace until end of turn. Crews for 2. We're making a ton of tokens, so this is not a hard cost to pay. Next up, we have Nadaloid Ship. This is 4 for a 5/5 flying. When Nadaloid Ship enters the battlefield, exile target player's graveyard. Whenever Nadaloid Ship deals combat damage to a player, you may put a creature card exiled with Nadaloid Ship onto the battlefield under your control. It crews for 3. So this has really amazing potential. It also has really amazing potential to just outright fail. If you get this early, you are going to sit on this card in your hand for quite some time before you see any real value from it, and that is a big downside. But when it does actually hit a graveyard with creatures in it, it actually has a fantastic upside. So, Nadaloid Ship. Next up, you have Orzhov Signet 2. You can tap 1 and 2, or tap 1 and it to create a white and a black. We have Parhelion 2. This is 6 and 2 white for a 5/5 flying first strike vigilance. Whenever Parhelion 2 attacks, create 2 4/4 white angel creature tokens with flying and vigilance that are attacking at crews for 4. Next we have Peace Walker Colossus, 3 for a 6/6. You can tap 1 and a white. Another target vehicle you control becomes an artifact creature until end of turn, crew for 4. We're getting that redundancy on turning your vehicles into creatures without having to crew them, just because, again, the likelihood of you having more vehicles than crew for them is actually pretty high. Next up, we have Prodigy's Prototype. 1 a white and a blue for a 3/4. Whenever 1 or more vehicles you control attack, create a 1/1 colorless pilot creature token with this creature crews vehicles as though its power were 2 greater. It crews for 2. So the pilot tokens are what really pushes this deck ahead. These pilot tokens crew as if they had a power of 3, and as I mentioned before, some of these crew costs can get really high, especially if you see Shirokai. So just getting those pilot tokens is really important. Next up, we have Reckoner Bankbuster. 2 for a 4/4. Reckoner Bankbuster enters the battlefield with 3 charge counters on it. For 2, you can tap it to remove a charge counter from Reckoner Bankbuster to draw a card. Then, if there are no charge counters on Reckoner Bankbuster, you get to create a treasure token and a 1/1 colorless pilot creature token, which crews for 3. And this also crews for 3. There is no downside to this. You get to draw cards, and then when you can't draw cards, you get a treasure token and a pilot. Super good. Next up, we have Shirokai Genesis Engine. 2 a white and a blue for an 8/8. You can tap 1 and this card to draw 2 cards, then discard a card. Create a 1/1 pilot creature token, and it crews for 8. And Shirokai Genesis Engine can be your commander. This was the original commander of the vehicle deck from the Neon Dynasty Kamigawa Commander decks. And honestly, there is little to no downside to this card. It's just a very, very good card. Next up, we have Sky Sovereign Console Flagship. 5 for a 6/5 flying. Whenever Sky Sovereign Console Flagship enters the battlefield or attacks, it deals 3 damage to target creature or planeswalker an opponent controls, and it crews for 3. Just great value. Just great value. Next up, we have Smuggler's Copter. This is 2 for a 3/3 flying. Whenever Smuggler's Copter attacks or blocks, you may draw a card. If you do, discard a card, crew for 1. This guy was infamous during Standard. It was so infamous, it got banned. Next, we have Soul Ring. For 1, you can tap it to add 2 colorless. Next, we have Surge Hacker Mech. For 4, it's a 5/5 menace. Whenever Surge Hacker Mech enters the battlefield, it deals damage equal to twice the number of vehicles you control to target creature or planeswalker an opponent controls, and it crews for 4. This is a perfect target for Anchor to Reality, especially if you need to get rid of something that is causing problems or quite possibly could be killing you. Next up, we have Unlicensed Hearse. This is 2 for a star. You can tap it to exile up to 2 target cards from a single graveyard. Unlicensed Hearse's power and toughness are each equal to the number of cards exiled with it. It has crew for 2. This is another one of those that it takes some time, which is great because it only costs 2. The sooner you can start exiling, the sooner this card gets out of hand very quickly. I believe last but not least, we have the Weatherlight. This is 4 for a 4/5 flying. Whenever Weatherlight deals combat damage to a player, look at the top 5 cards of your library. You may reveal a historic card from among them and put it into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. And just as a reminder, historic is artifacts, legendaries, or sagas. And you can crew it for 3. This is a great way to sift through and get exactly what you need when you need it. Alright, next up we're going to take a look at enchantments. Starting with Efficient Construction. For 3 and a blue. Whenever you cast an artifact spell, create a 1/1 colorless Thopter artifact creature token with flying. So we're getting more crew, we're also getting more artifacts for sacrificing, so on and so forth. Next up, we have Miradan Besiege. This is 2 and a blue. As Miradan Besiege enters the battlefield, choose Mirren or Phyrexian. If you choose Mirren, whenever you cast an artifact spell, create a 1/1 colorless Mir artifact creature token. Or if you choose Phyrexian at the beginning of your end step, draw a card, then discard a card. Then, if there are 15 or more artifact cards in your graveyard, target opponent loses the game. This is a really great way to either A, make everyone lose the game very quickly, or B, create a bunch of tokens that are artifacts and also can crew. Next up, we have Okiba Reckoner Raid for 1 black. This is a saga. For chapters 1 and 2, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain a life. And then for chapters 3, you get to exile the saga and return to the battlefield transformed under your control. And I'll, again, just take that off the camera real quick so I can flip that around to Nezumi Road Captain. This is a 2/2 menace. Vehicles you control have menace, so again, we're giving that evasion. Next up, we have Smothering Tithe, 3 and a white. Whenever an opponent draws a card, that player may pay 2. If that player does not, you get to create a colorless treasure token. This should be in every white deck, even though it's super duper expensive for obvious reasons. Not only are we getting artifacts to sacrifice, we can also sacrifice those artifacts for mana, so super good. Next up, we have Swift Reconfiguration for 1 white. Flash, enchant creature or vehicle. Enchanted permanent is a vehicle artifact with crew 5, and it loses all other card types. So there's 2 things that you can do with this. The probably lesser efficient thing you can do is you can actually use it as removal on your opponent's stuff by turning one of their big beaters into a vehicle and forcing them to have to crew it in order to use it. It does crew for 5, so it could take up some good attackers if you do that. The other thing is, though, you can actually use this, because it has flash, as a response to a board wipe to save one of your own creatures, turning it into a vehicle. And since there are a ton of ways to crew vehicles without actually crewing them, you may not even have to use that crew 5. And more importantly, since most things in here crew for well over their power, crew 5 isn't necessarily that big of a deal, so it can be used to save one of your creatures. Next up, I think actually last up, we have Thopter Spy Network. This is 2 and 2 blue. At the beginning of your upkeep, if you control an artifact, create a 1/1 colorless Thopter artifact creature token with flying, and whenever 1 or more artifact creatures you control deal combat damage to a player, you get to draw a card. Alright, next up we're going to look at Planeswalkers. We got 1 in here, Tezzeret Betrayer of Flesh. This guy is 2 and 2 blue for loyalty 4. Passive ability, the first activated ability of an artifact you activate this turn costs 2 less to activate. It's fantastic. For +1, you can draw 2 cards, then discard 2 cards unless you discard an artifact. For -2, target artifact becomes an artifact creature. If it's not a vehicle, it has a base power and toughness of 4/4. And for -6, you get an emblem with whenever an artifact you control becomes tapped, draw a card. There is literally no downside in this deck. The first ability, draw 2 cards and discard 2 cards unless you discard an artifact card, really helps with Miradan Besieged. Not to mention you get to draw cards. The -2 here turns a creature, an artifact, into a 4/4 unless it's a vehicle, in which case it just basically crews it for free. And then the emblem here, whenever you tap an artifact, you get to draw a card, which is going to happen so often you're just going to have a handful of cards. Next up, we're going to look at non-basic lands. Alright, starting with the prerequisites of Ancient Den. This taps for white and is an artifact land. Next up, we got Arcane Sanctum. Comes into play, or enters the battlefield tapped. You can tap it for white, blue, black. Got Buried Ruin. You can tap it for 1 colorless, or you can tap 2 and it, sacrifice it, and return an artifact card from your graveyard to your hand. Again, recursion. We have Command Tower. Tap it to add 1 mana of your commander's color identity. We have Darksteel Citadel, another artifact land. Enters the... Sorry, you can tap it for colorless, and it is indestructible. We got Deserted Beach. Check land for white-blue. Exotic Orchard. Taps for a color that your opponent's lands can produce. Again, you're playing 3 colors. We got Godless Shrine. Shock land for white-black, and counts as a plain swamp. We've got Goldmire Bridge, another artifact land. This one enters the battlefield tapped. It's indestructible and taps for white-black. Got Hallowed Fountain, shock land for white-blue. Counts as a plains or an island. So this was supposed to be an Inventor's Fair, and I totally forgot when I was setting this deck up that I still haven't received this in the mail yet. I should receive it this week, but I don't have it currently. Inventor's Fair, I'm going to try and show on the screen. Basically, at the beginning of your upkeep, if you control 3 or more artifacts, you gain a life. You can tap it for colorless, or you can tap 4 and sacrifice it to search your library for an artifact card, reveal it, put it into your hand, and shuffle your library, and you can only activate that ability if you have 3 or more artifacts. So it's a tutor at best, and it's colorless mana at worst. Plus you gain life. Next up we have Mech Hanger. This is tap for 1 white. You can also tap it to add 1 mana of any color. Spend this mana only to cast a pilot or vehicle spell, which is perfect for this deck. And then you can tap 3 and it to make target vehicle become an artifact creature until end of turn, so crew it without crewing it. Next up we have Mistfault Bridge. This guy comes into play tapped, is indestructible, is an artifact land, and taps for blue-black. I don't know why I'm messing that up so much today. Next we have Prairie Stream. This guy enters the battlefield tapped unless you control 2 or more basic lands. You can tap it for white or blue, and it counts as a plains or an island. Next up we have Rafine's Tower. This is the white, blue, black triome. You can cycle it for 3, enters the battlefield tapped, counts as a plains, island, swamp. Next we have Razortide Bridge, artifact land, enters the battlefield tapped, has indestructible, and taps for white, blue. Seat of Synod, artifact land, taps for blue. Spire of Industry, you can tap it for colorless, or you can tap it, pay a life, and add 1 mana of any color only to cast artifacts, which kind of doesn't make sense, but kind of does. We have Vault of Whispers, another artifact land. You can tap it for black. And then we have Watery Grave. This is the blue-black shock land. You can tap it for blue and black and counts as an island swamp. And then finally, we have our basic lands. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 islands. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 plains. And we have 1 swamp. So that is the Alela Artful Provocateur deck tech. As I said, mostly what it's about doing is creating those tokens so that we can crew our vehicles and use the vehicles to kind of get our lethal damage. There's tons of different recursions in here for vehicles. There's a ton of recursion for creating tokens, so on and so forth. So it's just a very interesting Esper deck. And that's kind of it, guys. If you have any comments or questions, leave those down below, but let's keep it positive. I will be removing any negative comments because we just don't need those in here. And that's it. Until next time, peace.